People's perception of what happened in the past is often different from reality. Sometimes the truth about how people lived before us is not as harsh as we thought it would be. Knights and Middle Ages. Pop culture has taught us to associate knights with the Middle Ages. In the eyes of a person who has little interest in history, a knight is a noble warrior in armor, just like a real hero, a liberator of the people, or a prince on a white horse. In fact, the Crusaders were common mercenary warriors. As a reward for their robberies, they received feudal estates with peasants. Peasants were forced to obey their lord, so slave labor kept the feudal estate and provided the knight with all the necessities of life. In modern times, knights may be called men with good manners and seducers of women. However, the gallantry has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. The main occupation of the knights was robbery campaign in foreign countries, with the ruin and capture of foreign cities. In general, knights rarely performed noble deeds. Speaking of Middle Ages, the acute problem of that era was not only frequent and unfair executions, but also endless robbery. For many townspeople, theft was the main method of earning money, because most of them simply could not do anything else. For many in those dark years, robbery was a craft and a matter of life. They looted anytime and anywhere. A typical medieval city was a paradise for a gang of thieves and its fruitful existence. Finding members to join the gang was as easy as shelling peas. Just go to a crowded place. Crimes were hindered more by competition than by danger of going to jail. This is how a huge number of gangs appeared during the Middle Ages. Egyptian builders. The Egyptian pyramids are a giant treasure of Africa, the most memorable wonder of the world. They were built with the back-breaking labor of slaves for many years. Or is it just another legend? Huge pyramids were not built by slaves, but by the free peasants engaged in agriculture. The fact is that the tombs could not be built only by slaves. One of the reasons is because in Egypt slavery was not so widespread. Moreover, the Egyptians labored by their own free will. The construction of the pyramids fell on the shoulders of landowners, who had free time and little means of subsistence. With irrigation systems, cultivation of the land in the arid Egyptian desert took less labor resources. In order to avoid unemployment, landowners were involved in the construction of various kinds. And these hard workers built more than just pyramids. By the way, many imagine the Egyptian pyramids in bright sand color. They were not always like this. The builders made them from white limestone, which eventually lost its snow-white color, and then became covered with sand and turned yellow. The builders had their own small villages. There they had lunch breaks and rested. There were also workshops for tools, a kitchen, and even a brewery. And it didn't look like a slave life. Need barbarians. They were Vikings, not by origin, by their vocation. Someone decided to call all the Asian Scandinavians Vikings. But this is the wrong term. The people to whom the Vikings belonged were called the Normans, and they lived on the Scandinavian peninsula. Some Normans became seafarers and began to travel to rich and fertile lands in order to colonize them or develop a profitable trade. Sometimes they could, like aforementioned knights, organize raids to seize foreign territories, but this rarely happened. These were the Vikings. By the way, the Vikings never had a horned helmet. The church of that era tried to demonize the image of the conquerors and made up the myth of the horns. However, it went so far that it took several centuries to expose it. The Vikings and all the Normans in general took great care of their appearance, which cannot be said about medieval warriors. A typical Viking is associated with rudeness, untidiness, and shagginess. In fact, it was quite the opposite. In the Norman burials, in archaeological excavation, the most frequent finds are combs, razors, and everything that helped to keep the barbarians neat. Scandinavians were despised for the grooming by many European countries, especially England. The Normans, in the very north of the country, devoted every Saturday to self-care, arranged a bath day, and made soap. A bloody sport. What do people imagine when they hear about gladiator fights? Brutal battles, thirst for blood, and fight to the last breath. In fact, gladiators rarely died in the battlefield. Such fighters were considered as an investment in the enthusiastic views of the public. They were trained, their health was monitored, and they were prepared for performance. In other words, they were athletes, but with a specific focus. Gladiators were rented by sponsors, and if a fighter died unexpectedly, then the coach received 50 times more money than from a normal fighter rent. If the gladiator came out of the battle alive, then the coach invested in his treatment and continued to look for work for him. The probability of a fighter being killed in the arena was approximately 10%, so fights usually ended in death only in exceptional cases. Harem. Was it really involuntary? Harem of the Ottoman Empire was considered to be for captive girls, where they did not have any rights and in general were cruelly abused. However, the actual customs of the Ottomans were fundamentally different from this. The concubine could leave the harem, especially if her stay in it had already exceeded 9 years, and she had never shared a bed with the sultan. She was given a large dowry and married to someone close to the sultan. But in fact, there were not so many women who wanted to leave the palace, since the condition of detention was pretty good. In the harem, concubines often received money without doing any work, gladly accepted gifts, and in general did not refuse themselves anything. The harem itself was not a place just for beautiful girls. It was more like a place for noble maidens, where every day in the morning young ladies were taught manners, language, poetry, and studied Islam. This also applied to the sultan's wives. Instruction on behavior were important, and were even written on the walls of the harem, so the girls could see them every day. That way they could never forget how they should behave. Mostly, these were phrases from the Quran. Many amateur researchers believe that these inscriptions were romantic poems that aroused passion in girls. Also, girls did not have to lure the sultan with the oriental dances. This practice was largely not used. Thus, the concubines were not taught this art of seduction. Greek Patriarchate. Ancient Greece seems at first glance a cultural and enlightened civilization, and the ancient Greeks themselves were all philosophers. The generalized idea of the Greeks is formed from the cult of antiquity, when the whole history of ancient Greece was romanticized by people during the Enlightenment era. In fact, the sublime creativity of the Greeks has nothing to do with their everyday life. Ancient Greece lived according to the rules of the tribal community of the Bronze Age. This means that family relations were considered the main foundation of society, and they were given special importance. The patriarchy led the families, and it was tough. The indisputable head of the tribal clan was the father. After him was his elder son, even if he was adopted. The head of the family could even sacrifice his own children, of course, if it was the will of the gods for that. By the way, if the father found himself in a difficult financial situation, nothing prevented him from selling his daughters. He also could expel his sons from the house for disobedience. Moreover, the legislation of ancient Greece consolidated this role. In ancient Greek myths, almost every story revolves around love and bright and elevated feelings. In reality, the Greeks created a family mostly for procreation and for the benefit of the parents of both parties. Sometimes, marriage turned into an auction. By the way, the Greeks had a mandatory wedding ritual. The bridegroom carried his future wife in his arms into his house, pretending to have kidnapped her. The girl had to scream and show her displeasure in every way, as if she was taken to a new family by force. Such a ritual personifies the transition of the bride from one clan to another and submission to her husband. In other words, the owner. Despite the fact that in the everyday life of the Greeks, property was considered common between husband and wife, a woman had almost no rights. She could only be concerned with household chores, the management of slaves, if the family was wealthy, and all other matters were entrusted to the man. Manners of the 20th century. Times change, and customs change with them. Some things get into the trend, some things become obsolete and go out of use. Manners and attitudes between men and women have changed especially dramatically in the last 100 years. It is interesting to look at old photographs and imagine what life used to be like. Here are a few examples. In this photo, a special worker checks if the length of the swimsuit is appropriate. This is impossible to imagine today. And in this photo, the cabaret agent conducts a casting. Look at his face. He is clearly surprised. And in this photo, which you could see on the cover of this video, the ladies invite gentlemen to a white dance. Yes, it used to be like that.